Okay, so jumping right in then with Identify Stakeholder Process, 13.1, page 507. So it starts at the same time or prior to the project charter. You're always identifying stakeholders from the very beginning. If the questions ask you by process, when do you identify stakeholders? The answer is identify stakeholders process. But if it says when are you identifying stakeholders, the answer is always. And notice that subtle distinction will help you a lot on my quizzes and on future PMP style exam. Okay, so this is a process again that happens regularly, especially at the start of every phase. Start of every phase should start with initiating. You should go through IPAC, and you will start identifying stakeholders. So the inputs, tools, and outputs follow. The inputs, and I made a little quiz here. You might want to pause now and try and fill in the blanks based on what you've learned so far. Okay, so welcome back then. The project charter, a key is a key input, right? Because it listed high-level stakeholders, okay? And this is a list made during what process group? Well, the charter is made, if you look on page 25, during the initiating process group. We talked a little bit about business documents, which are two: the business case and the business management plan. And another input is the project management plan. Think about it. And this will help you out a lot on the exam if you think of where you're at and what you need. Remember, I've said over and over, stakeholders and communication are tied hand in glove. They are rarely ever separated. And so the project management plan, especially the stakeholder management plan, and as it's been developed, and the communications management plan becomes very important here. Okay? And then we could have agreements, which are part of the like the contract, service level agreements, master service agreements, MSAs, and EEFs and OPAs. More on those on page 510. So then moving to tools. I don't really have much at this point, but I do have, because I'm still in the initiating process group, but I do have expert judgment. We've always tied expert judgment to a couple of terms. One is individual group, and the other is a specialized knowledge. In this case of politics, power, culture, and industry. Do you ever notice you go to your boss, and you say, hey boss, what would you do? And because of various stakeholders and they're 15, 20 years in a business, they go, oh, well, I would handle this one like that. It's because they understand the culture and the individual at the same time. Then I can gather data. I have done stakeholder identification through questionnaires, surveys, and brainstorming. Brainwriting is getting people to write down their thoughts on a topic before they come to brainstorming. And then brainstorming enhances that effort. That's called brainwriting. And there's data analysis, which is, for example, stakeholder analysis. We're going to do a little bit of that later in this lesson. Data representation and meetings. Okay, we are going to talk about data representation, the Salience Model, grids, etc. in a few lectures coming up this week. And then my output is my stakeholder register. This is what I wanted. Notice my process is called Identify Stakeholders. My output, my key output, is a stakeholder register. A register just means a list. It's a list. Later we'll have a risk register. What is that? Just a list of risks. Okay? So here we have a stakeholder register. But in that I'm going to show the stakeholders the influence, interests, are they sensitive, etc. I may even have change requests because as I've identified stakeholders, those stakeholders are the ones that will identify changes and I'll ask them to do change requests. And as a result then, I may have project plan updates like to the communications management plan or project document updates. Now this slide shows a sample stakeholder register. It's not locked in stone. You could add many things to it to make it wholly complete for you. And I want to point out, you would list the name of the stakeholder. Notice around the middle, the type of stakeholder, the type of communication you want. Some you'll send a PowerPoint to, some you'll send an email, some you won't want to communicate like that very often. Others you'll want to call. What are their expectations, interests, and influence on the project? I'm trying to really understand them and capture them so that I can communicate with them. That's, again, the value of stakeholder management. So I can communicate more effectively. Okay. Now, all right, there we go, back on track. We did talk about some models that you can use, and one is the power and interest model. So you see on the y-axis we have power, and on the horizontal or x-axis we have, in this case, interest, power and interest grid, I would call this. And then my stakeholders can fall into 4 quadrants. I need to satisfy them, I want to monitor their activities, I want to manage them, which is a lot more work, or just keep them informed. So if, say, they have high power but low interest in the project, it's valuable just to satisfy them. That's how I would use that. And there are many other forms of grids that I could use to address stakeholders. So it doesn't have to just be power and interest. It could be power and relevance, right? Power and influence would be another one, that sort of thing. That's okay. Then I have the Salience Model. And the Salience Model involves 3 key words that you'll see on just about any exam: power, legitimacy, and urgency. Now these words in the middle you don't need to memorize for the PMP style exam or for my exam. We're just showing you how they might fit in there. So where all 3 triangles circles come together, that's a definitive stakeholder. You really want to work with them. One that has power and urgency, so those 2 cube circles coming together, that's a dangerous stakeholder in my mind. One that has legitimacy only would be a discretionary stakeholder. So this is how you can use this grid to map. And if they're outside of power, urgency, or legitimacy, frankly, they're a non-stakeholder. Okay. Now, moving on then to plan stakeholder management. Okay, this involves stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, and interests. This is what the plan their engagement process is about. Plan stakeholder engagement. In fact, instead of plan stakeholder management, I should have their plan stakeholder engagement. Okay? And you can see more on that on page 516, section 13.2. Okay? And there are typical trigger situations requiring updates of these stakeholder lists. When I start a new phase, I'm looking for new stakeholders. When there are changes in the organization, that's going to trigger looking for new stakeholders. When there are new stakeholders arrive in the military, we have people move in and out of bases on average, especially at the officer level, but senior, enlisted, and many other people. Every 2 years is a common cycle, 4 tops, every 4 years. So stakeholders are always changing. Even if they don't leave a base, they are taking the skills they've learned in one job and being moved to another job to apply those there and learn other skills. So stakeholders are always changing their location, are some of the triggers. Now, for inputs, the project charter, of course, because whenever I plan stakeholders, I'm going to go back to the charter. The charter listed some high-level stakeholders for me, and so that becomes a very important piece. I'm going to involve the project management plan. So resource management is going to give me some clues regarding roles and responsibilities of stakeholders. The communication management plan should come to mind because I'm in stakeholder management and I said they're tied together. And the risk management plan becomes very important because stakeholders have what's called risk thresholds and risk attitudes. And so the risk management plan should easily come to mind. Project documents always include the issues log, the risk register, assumptions log, and change log. One note about the assumptions log is it's going to be linked to specific stakeholders. And it often lists also constraints, assumptions and constraints. Now, the agreements, EEFs, and OPAs. Agreements, I just like to point out, as the PMBOK guide does, contractors and suppliers. This involves working with the procurement group of your own company and the procurement manager. And then in the book, note the EEFs and OPA examples. Now, tools, and also Rita's book gives some good advice along these inputs, tools, and outputs. Now, the tools involve expert judgment, which we have said is a specialized knowledge, data gathering, which it can be benchmarking. It's not limited, so I say e.g., which means for example, benchmarking. Data analysis includes challenging the assumptions and constraints, so doing an analysis on those so that I can tailor the appropriate engagement strategies. The other one is root cause analysis. What are the root causes? What are the underlying reasons for the level of support required? Okay. Data representation also comes to mind as a tool. Data representation includes mind mapping. Mind mapping means I put the center idea, what I'm trying to achieve, in a circle in the center, and I draw out lines from it, anything that connects to it and how they might be related, a mind map. If you do Google on that, you can see some examples of a mind map. Or a stakeholder engagement matrix, assessment matrix. This is a matrix that supports a comparison between the current engagement levels and the desired engagement levels. And we categorize those stakeholders as they're either unaware of the project, resistant to the project, neutral, supportive, or leading. And then, of course, when my project is, and what we want to do with that stakeholder engagement matrix is look for a gap between the current state and the desired state that is going to drive a new level of communication. Okay. Then the last tool is meetings. As an output, I'm going to have, so notice the plan is called Plan Stakeholder Engagement, and the output is the Stakeholder Engagement Plan. You're just moving the words around. Plan Stakeholder Engagement Process. The output is the Stakeholder Engagement Plan. Okay, and that's all there is to that. I'm going to stop here, and we will pick it up again with Managed Stakeholders.